Imagine waking up one day and realizing that the world around you has become louder, yet strangely emptier. Not emptier of people or information or opinions. Those are everywhere, flooding your phone, your conversations, your social media feeds. Everyone seems to have something to say. Everyone seems certain about everything. But something subtle has vanished. Something that once separated wisdom from noise. Imagine scrolling through endless arguments where nobody is truly listening. Opinions collide like waves against rocks, each one louder than the last, yet none actually moving the tide. People repeat slogans instead of ideas. They share conclusions without ever questioning the path that led there. And the strange part, most people don't even notice. Now, imagine walking into a room filled with hundreds of people discussing an important issue: politics, morality, science, the future of humanity. You would expect disagreement, debate, curiosity. But instead, something unsettling happens. Everyone seems to arrive with their conclusions already locked in place. Questions are no longer invitations to explore truth. They are weapons used to defend beliefs. Disagreement isn't treated as an opportunity to think deeper. It becomes a threat. And slowly, without anyone announcing it, something dangerous begins to emerge. A world where thinking is replaced by reacting, where understanding is replaced by belonging, where the goal is no longer truth but approval. How did this happen? Human beings have never had more access to knowledge. Entire libraries live inside our pockets. The greatest ideas of philosophers, scientists, and thinkers from thousands of years are available within seconds. So why does it feel like thinking itself is becoming rarer? Why do complex conversations collapse into tribal shouting matches? Why do people increasingly choose comforting beliefs over uncomfortable truths? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, what if the disappearance of critical thinking isn't an accident? What if it is the natural result of forces quietly shaping how we see the world, how we form opinions, and even how we define ourselves? Because the truth is far more unsettling than simple ignorance. This is not merely intelligence. It is about something deeper, something psychological, something cultural, something that once it takes hold begins to spread silently, turning groups of intelligent individuals into something far more dangerous than stupidity alone. A collective mind that stops questioning, a society that stops thinking. And the terrifying part is this: when critical thinking disappears, people rarely notice it leaving. They simply feel more certain than ever before. But to understand how this silent transformation happens, you first have to confront the hidden forces inside the human mind itself. And that is where the real story begins. To understand why critical thinking is disappearing, you must first confront an uncomfortable truth about the human mind. Human beings are not naturally wired to seek truth. They are wired to seek comfort. For thousands of years, survival depended less on being correct and more on belonging. To question the beliefs of your tribe too aggressively could mean exile, and exile in ancient environments often meant death. So the brain adapted. Instead of rewarding those who think differently, it quietly rewards those who think together. This ancient instinct never disappeared, it simply evolved into something more subtle. Today, the tribe is no longer just a small village or a hunting group. The tribe has become ideological, digital, cultural. It exists in political identities, online communities, social movements, and belief systems. And once you belong to a tribe, something fascinating begins to happen inside your mind. Your brain stops asking, "Is this true?" Instead, it begins asking a much more dangerous question: does this align with my group? The famous psychologist Carl Jung warned about this phenomenon when he described the terrifying power of the collective psyche. When individuals merge into a group identity, their personal capacity for reflection often dissolves. The group begins to think for them. And history has shown how dangerous that can become. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote about what he called herd morality, the tendency of societies to reward conformity and punish independent thought. In a herd, the individual who questions too much becomes a threat, not because they are wrong, but because they disrupt unity. Then there was Arthur Schopenhauer, who observed that most people are less interested in discovering truth than in defending the opinions they already hold. Once an idea becomes part of someone's identity, challenging it feels like a personal attack. So the mind resists, not logically, emotionally. Modern psychology has only confirmed what these philosophers suspected centuries ago. The human brain is riddled with cognitive shortcuts, confirmation bias, motivated reasoning, group polarization. These mechanisms quietly filter information, allowing us to accept ideas that confirm our beliefs while rejecting those that threaten them. Critical thinking, in other words, requires something extremely unnatural. It requires you to question yourself, to doubt your own tribe, to admit that you might be wrong. And in a world increasingly driven by identity, belonging, and instant validation, that kind of intellectual humility becomes rare. But there is another layer to this problem, one far more powerful than tribal instinct alone, because modern society has discovered something remarkable. A population that stops questioning is far easier to influence. And once systems begin rewarding outrage, simplicity, and ideological certainty, something extraordinary begins to happen. Entire societies slowly drift away from thinking, not because people are incapable of intelligence, but because the environment around them quietly discourages it. And the consequences of that shift are far more profound than most people realize. Because when critical thinking fades, it doesn't just change how people argue, it changes how they live. Once critical thinking begins to fade, the change rarely feels dramatic. There are no alarms, no sudden collapse of intelligence. Instead, the shift happens quietly, almost invisibly, woven into everyday life. People still talk, they still debate, they still feel passionate about ideas, but something essential beneath those conversations slowly erodes: the ability to pause and question. One of the most powerful forces driving this transformation is something psychologists call confirmation bias, the mind's tendency to search for, interpret, and remember information in a way that confirms what we already believe. At first glance, this seems harmless. After all, everyone has opinions. But when entire information systems begin feeding this bias, the effect becomes something far more dangerous. Algorithms learn what you like. They show you more of it. They hide what contradicts it. Slowly, your worldview becomes less like a window and more like a mirror. Instead of encountering ideas that challenge you, you encounter reflections of your own beliefs repeated back to you again and again. Over time, something strange begins to happen. Your confidence increases, while your understanding decreases. This is closely related to what psychologists call the Dunning-Kruger effect, a cognitive bias where people with limited knowledge on a topic often feel more certain about their conclusions than those who had studied it deeply. Why? Because true expertise exposes complexity. The more you understand a subject, the more you see how much you don't know. But when critical thinking disappears, complexity feels uncomfortable. People begin craving simple explanations, clear villains, and absolute certainty. Reality becomes reduced to slogans: good versus evil, us versus them, right versus wrong. And when millions of people begin seeing the world through this simplified lens, society itself starts to change. Public discourse becomes more hostile, nuance disappears, intellectual humility begins to look like weakness. Admitting uncertainty becomes socially dangerous. Even curiosity starts to fade, because curiosity requires vulnerability, the willingness to say, "I don't know yet."
But in a culture that rewards instant opinions and confident declarations, doubt becomes a liability. So people stop exploring ideas. They defend them instead. And perhaps the most disturbing consequence of all is this. When a society loses its capacity for critical thinking, it becomes incredibly vulnerable, not just to misinformation, but to manipulation. Narratives become easier to control. Fear spreads faster than reason. Crowds move not through reflection, but through emotional momentum. And history has shown again and again what can happen when entire populations begin reacting instead of thinking. Yet here lies the paradox. The same mind that can fall into these traps also holds the power to escape them. But escaping requires something radical. It requires rebellion, not against society, but against the most comfortable habits of your own mind. And that rebellion begins with a question very few people are willing to ask. What if the beliefs you feel most certain about are the ones you should examine the most?
Escaping the collapse of critical thinking does not begin with arguing louder. It begins with something far more difficult: learning how to doubt yourself. This idea feels almost unnatural. From childhood, most people are taught to be confident in their opinions, to defend their beliefs, to stand firmly on one side of an argument. Confidence is praised, certainty is rewarded, but true thinkers have always followed a different path. The ancient philosopher Socrates built his entire philosophy around a strange admission: I know that I know nothing. It wasn't an expression of ignorance, it was an expression of intellectual freedom. Because the moment you accept that your knowledge may be incomplete, something powerful happens. Your mind reopens. You begin to explore instead of defend. Centuries later, psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl observed something profound about human freedom. Even in the most extreme conditions, he argued, there remains one space that cannot be taken away: the space between stimulus and response. In that space lies choice, and in that choice lies the possibility of thinking differently from the crowd. Breaking free from collective stupidity does not mean rejecting society. It means refusing to outsource your thinking to it. It means questioning ideas, even when they come from your own group, especially when they come from your own group. This kind of rebellion is quiet. It rarely looks dramatic. Often it begins with small habits that feel almost insignificant. Pausing before reacting to an emotional headline. Reading an article that contradicts your beliefs instead of dismissing it. Asking yourself a simple but uncomfortable question: what evidence would prove me wrong? Most people never ask that question, because once you do, you begin to realize that many of your beliefs were never carefully examined. They were inherited from culture, from family, from political identities, from the invisible pressure to belong. Independent thinking can feel lonely at first. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre argued that freedom is both a gift and a burden. When you truly think for yourself, you can no longer hide behind the comfort of collective certainty. You become responsible for your own conclusions. But something extraordinary happens when you accept that responsibility. Your mind becomes sharper. Your curiosity returns. Ideas stop being weapons used to win arguments and start becoming tools used to understand reality. And slowly, something rare begins to grow again. Not just intelligence, but wisdom. Yet even this rebellion leads to a deeper realization, one that changes how you see society, truth, and even yourself. Because the ultimate discovery is not simply that critical thinking is disappearing, it's understanding why so few people are willing to protect it. At the end of this journey, a strange and unsettling truth begins to emerge. The disappearance of critical thinking is not simply the result of manipulation, technology, or social pressure. Those forces play a role, but the deeper truth is far more uncomfortable. Most people do not lose critical thinking, they trade it away.
because thinking deeply comes with a cost. It forces you to live with uncertainty. It forces you to admit that the world is more complex than simple narratives. It forces you to question beliefs that may have shaped your identity for years, and that can feel terrifying. Certainty, on the other hand, feels safe. It provides clarity, belonging, and emotional comfort. It allows you to see the world as a clear battle between right and wrong, heroes and villains, truth and lies. No ambiguity, no painful doubt, just answers. The problem is that reality rarely works this way. The writer Aldous Huxley once warned that the greatest threat to freedom would not come from oppression alone, but from people's willingness to accept comforting illusions instead of difficult truths. In other words, societies don't collapse into collective stupidity because people are incapable of intelligence. They collapse because comfort becomes more valuable than truth. When that shift happens, thinking itself becomes dangerous. People who ask too many questions are seen as troublemakers. Nuance becomes suspicious. Complexity becomes exhausting. Simplicity becomes addictive. And so the mind slowly adapts. It stops exploring. It starts repeating. But here is the final realization, the one that changes everything. Critical thinking was never meant to belong to the crowd. It has always been a minority skill. Throughout history, every meaningful leap in human progress came from individuals willing to question what everyone else accepted as obvious. Scientists who challenged established theories, philosophers who confronted moral assumptions, writers who exposed uncomfortable truths about society. They all shared one trait. They were willing to stand alone with their thoughts. And that is the quiet responsibility placed on every individual who refuses to surrender their mind to the comfort of collective certainty. Because the future of intelligence will not be decided by how much information exists. It will be decided by how many people are still willing to question it. So the real question is no longer whether critical thinking is disappearing. The real question is far more personal. In a world that constantly encourages you to react, repeat, and conform, will you choose to think?